Hey guys, you remember my personal altimeter that I built using a barometric pressure sensor, and just so far it had just this LCD display and it would show you altitude, vertical speed, temperature, barometric pressure, and a bunch of other stuff, and that was pretty fun. And so then I hooked up a speaker, and the speaker, I basically was playing like a different frequency based on your altitude and through the speaker. So as you go up and down stairs, you can hear the pitch go up and back down. I'm using this cup here to amplify the sound, and what I wanted to show you was I found this pretty interesting. The sort of natural sounds that this thing makes when it starts up is pretty cool and interesting, and I wanted to figure out and see if I could explain why it made all the different sounds. So without further ado, I'm going to start it up. Okay, so there it is. It's stabilized and calibrated, and you can hear the tone kind of go up and down a little bit. And what you're listening to there is the natural change in barometric pressure that is happening in sort of real time. And the way those tones change makes me think that we're basically listening to the wind as different waves of air are passing through. The barometric pressure goes up and down, and I find that very fascinating. But the startup sound is really what got me, and I can explain some of the sounds, or at least I think I can. The one that's sort of the most notable is that it sounds like there's an interval. There's a doot 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 doot, and there's a sort of short period of time in that interval where it sounds really crunchy. It's not a perfectly smooth value. And I think the reason it's doing that is because I'm using the Arduino library to drive a pin on and off, and it uses the PWM timer for that. And the PWM timer is hardware, so it wouldn't necessarily. It seems like it could just run asynchronously without being interfered with, but through the Arduino library, what I think it's doing is, because I'm not using the PWM pin, I'm using one of the other pins, there has to be an interrupt for when the timer reaches its, the top of the value, whatever. There has to be an interrupt where it calls a little subroutine that just turns that pin on and off, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually has to take some CPU to do that. And so what I think is happening is that crunch is when it enters the function where it does all of the mathematics for the smoothing. There's a linear regression algorithm, and then also there's some averaging that happens to sort of smooth out the sensor data, because otherwise it's very noisy. So I put that linear regression thing in there to smooth it out. And so as it is running through those mathematics, I think it's just competing with the CPU for that interrupt, and that's why you hear that kind of crunchy sound. So that's my theory on that one. And then the sweeping sounds at the beginning also, I believe, are a consequence of the linear regression math. First when it starts up, it starts at 0, and then it needs to hunt to the value that it's at, and then it does a calibration step, and then it needs to hunt for that new value, and then it overcompensates. The model drives it, overshoots the value, and then it comes back up. And this would be sort of similar kind of sound if you just thought about it, just like a moving average would do sort of the same thing. But the thing I can't quite explain is right when it first starts up, or I kind of have a theory, I'm not sure if it's right, but right when it first starts up, the interval that it's running at appears to be very slow. That's running much more slowly than it does once it finds its, once it's calibrated out and stabilized. And I think what's happening there, I'm going to test this. I think what's happening there is I'm trying to drive maybe a negative value into the frequency, or it's just a low value, and for some reason that blocks for longer when you configure it. But I don't see why it would, because you're basically just setting endpoints on the PWM timer, so it shouldn't. I don't see why it should block at all. So I can't quite explain that one, but I think that's close. And So I think I can explain almost all the sounds. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting, and maybe you did too. Peace.